Stanford University.
It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this workshop on memory and history in a global dimension with a strong emphasis on the greater Middle East and the question of Israel-Palestine. I'll say more about the background of this workshop in a minute, but before that I'd like to introduce my partner in crime, Gabriel Motzkin of the Leer Institute.
Hello everybody, I'm going to talk sitting down, and the first thing I want to do is welcome you on behalf of my half of this collaboration, which is the Leer Jerusalem Institute. And I won't bore you anymore with what we do, but I'll have to explain another time. What I'd like to do is start off by saying something about what is behind this conference. On the way to the John, just before giving this talk, I went outside and I passed something called the Stanford Center on Longevity, right here to the left. And I was thinking about, that made me think about the longevity of memory. And what that is. How long do memories survive? And what does it mean? What do we mean by the survival of the memory? Now, human beings have existed for 200,000 years max. 200,000 years is 8,000 generations. And the year, of course, is an astronomical kind of time, but generations is a human kind of time. 8,000 generations divides up the following way. Since the time of Christ, 80 generations maybe have passed. And memories, at least living memories, passed down by families, survived at the extreme for 6 generations. I met somebody who fought with Napoleon. And that's about as far back as you can go, 150 years, and that's at 1 or 2 degrees of separation. Now, it's since the memories for a lot of us are Israelis and Palestinians, the memories that are constituted for us have now survived 3 generations, but of course, they don't survive, and that's the next thing is personal memory. Somebody has to tell it to somebody, and of course, I have no memory of anything that happened before 1948 or 49 when I was 3 years old. So we have to think a little about what does it mean for a memory to survive in a population if it's not a personal memory, and how far back does that go, and when does it all fade together and become part of history. I say that because I think sometimes we all human beings tend to maximize the time closest to them. That's to say, to think that life goes on for the 30 or 40 years that they understand. They have some vague memory of World War II. I was born in the end of 45. I have some vague memory of having heard about World War II from people who fought it, but not much more than that. And I think we have to control for this illusion, because all the questions that you will raise today are based on this kind of shaded time in which we live, all the way back. I think basically that events today, we're in 2012, events today before around 1850 are beyond our ken except as history. In other words, nobody in this room, I think, has any memory of having met anybody, or am I wrong, who fought with Marlborough at Blenheim, or who remembers the Congress of Vienna? No, I don't think so. And I think that that's something we have to take into account very seriously, because after that, history is reconstructed as a literary phenomenon. I will stop there because I'm going to talk a lot more in my talk, and I'm going to pass it back to Amir, so it's your turn.
Thank you, Gabi. So what I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes or so is just to tell you something about the larger project of which this workshop is a part of. Going to the background of how we got to today. Today's workshop and tomorrow's workshop is a part of an ongoing project that the Europe Center is conducting together with the Leer Institute under the somewhat fancy title of Debating History, Democracy, Development and Education in Conflicted Societies. So the idea is to try to think about a conflict and debate in a global setting and to concentrate on issues such as democracy, memory and history, education, etc. The first step we took on our way to build up this conversation was a conference on democracy that took place exactly a year ago in Jerusalem, titled Democracy in Adversity and Diversity. And you see some of the topics discussed in this conference listed here on the slide. Democracy in comparative perspective, political reform, the very difficult term regime transition, and other topics that you see on the slide. Now, some of you may ask, why does a Europe Center at Stanford University, we're very close to Asia, is thinking about these issues and looking at the greater Middle East, including the question of Israel and Palestine? The answer to this is twofold from my perspective. First of all, as we all know, Europe, especially the European Union, is now in the context of what's called the Barcelona process. In the Barcelona process, the European Union, European community, is looking at its neighborhood very closely, thinking about not Europe of today, but Europe of a decade, 2 decades ahead. And the region that is pretty much at the center of this future thinking in Europe today is the region called Euromed, which includes the Eastern Mediterranean and Northern Africa. Political, social, cultural issues that are very important in this region are also political, cultural, social issues that are important in today's Europe. We can think of migration, of religion, question of civil society, democracy, etc., that are very important for the societies of the Euromed region, are also questions that are very important for European societies today. So for us, trying to think of Europe not only in the narrow context of quote-unquote old Europe, or in the context of the European Union, means also thinking about the Eastern Mediterranean and Northern Africa as a part of a larger context. And as many people living in Europe today know, and as the European Commission says time and again, the question of the greater Middle East, and especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are at the center of what bothers people in the Euromed area. Now, some of the questions I hope we can discuss in the workshop today and tomorrow were at the center of the conversations that led to this workshop. First and foremost, we'd like to together ask ourselves, what are the central issues in the global, cross-disciplinary, academic, and cultural discourse regarding memory and history? As we all know, memory and history is at the center of academic discussion for the last 3 decades or so. Beyond academic context, issues of memory and history were debated, at least in the West and in Western cultures, over the last few decades in an enormous, some people say even obsessive manner. So one of the aims, or one of the questions I hope we'll address today and tomorrow is the question, where are we today in this global cross-disciplinary discussion regarding memory and history? Now, following that, very important, how may this discourse inform how we think about, but not just think about, but also what we may do regarding conflicted societies of the greater Middle East, for example, regarding Israel and Palestine. In other words, can the knowledge and the theoretical conceptual thinking that emerged from the discussion of memory and history over the last few decades, can this huge discussion, scholarly interest, inform somehow how we understand what's going on today in the greater Middle East, especially when we think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? In a more concrete manner, also coming from my own scholarly work, can the European experience in dealing with difficult chapters of European history, I am a German studies scholar, so can the European experience somehow inform and affect the ways in which societies of the Middle East, Israelis and Palestinians, think about and handle their own difficult history? So, what are existing forms of historical research regarding crucial moments of political violence as a more concrete question? And at the center of this question, I personally see the Nakba as a prime example. So how do we deal with 1948 and its most difficult chapter, namely the expulsion and flight of Palestinians from Palestine in this context? Related to that, what are existing forms of cultural and public commemoration of such moments include? So what is happening there? What is done in this regard today in the cultural context. And in a moment, I'll give you one example coming out of my own work. For me, a very important question is not just what was done in the last few decades and what is done today, but also what may be done, what may emerge in the future. So as we are taking account of the current situation, I hope we can also discuss together possible ways of dealing with these difficult chapters in the future, and I hope we can say more to that in the course of the conference. So to be more concrete about this, the last 2 points on this slide, how do we account for diverging and conflicting memories and diverging and conflicting historical accounts? We all know that for one historical chapter, dark as it may be, and again the Nakba is a good example, there are diverging and conflicting memories. So how do we account for that? How do we deal with that? And related to this question, what is the role of historical research on the one hand and of cultural remembrance on the other hand in promoting reconciliation or cohabitation? Now, as we all know, over the last few decades, a lot has been said and partly done in regard to the so-called peace process. I hope we will not spend too much time talking about the peace process in this workshop because I think it's really not the topic. However,
which process, Amir?
okay, that's a good point. I'll return to this in a moment. Still, the issue of reconciliation, and even more importantly, cohabitation, seems to me to be very important at the moment. Given the current situation, not just in Israel-Palestine, but really in the greater Middle East, Arab Spring is just one phrase that one could mention here. I think that the issue of cohabitation, how do we live together, what is needed for the maintaining and enhancing civil society, democratic institutions, etc., that seems to me to be a very important question. Now, when we think about historical research, we all know that over the last few decades, a lot has been done in what's called critical historiography. So coming from the history of Zionism, we have the new historians, we have the post-Zionist discourse. There was a lot of thinking about how Israelis, Zionists, Jewish historians can reflect critically on their own history. I think that I notice a new trend in historical research and historical writing in the last decade or so that focuses on narrative, the question of narrative, the question of how we tell the story. And I'd like to mention, in regard to what I see as a trend, two very interesting examples. One is a book just published a year ago by Moti Golani and Adel Mana. I think Gabriel can say more about this book later on. This book talks about two sides of the coin, independence and Nakba 1948. So it tries to tell the story of 1948 by creating a common narrative for people who come from obviously the two sides of the conflict or two sides of that history. So the book presents the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a conflict over territory and a conflict over historical narrative. Another attempt done by this book is to present a multi-perspective narrative of the war. Similarly interesting, also a recently published book in the same series is a book by Mahmoud Yazbak and Ifat Weiss. Ifat Weiss was supposed to join us for this workshop. Unfortunately, she couldn't. This is a very interesting book that collects 40 narratives about the city of Haifa before and after 1948. So 14 Israelis and 14 Palestinians created 14 mutually written or co-written narratives of different aspects of the city of Haifa and collected them into one book. And by doing so, by trying to come together with one narrative co-written by Palestinians and Israelis, we have a book that dares to do something quite interesting and I would say important. These two books are accompanied by another book on 1948 that I just got a year ago, a book that documents the fate of the refugees in 1948 in a very impressive manner. And what I will do is maybe pass on the book in a moment so you could see what's done here. All three books, so the two mentioned in the slide and this book I'm holding in my hand, are a part of a series that is published by the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation, and the Republic of Letters, a Dutch publisher, is bringing them out. Similarly and related to these experiments, now speaking about education, I'd like to draw your attention to something I just got as a gift from our Van Leer guests. These are school materials prepared by Van Leer and Al-Quds University in East Jerusalem, in Palestinian Jerusalem, that hopefully will help teachers in schools to present similar narratives to the narratives presented in these scholarly books to students, to Israeli and Palestinian kids who go to school and attend school, and bring them a different perspective on their national histories. So what I'll do is just pass this on, and you can take a look now and later. Now, talking about cultural discourse, which is the field of my own work, I think a somewhat understudied, underconsidered field in our looking at questions of memory and history. Let me mention a few things that I think are quite interesting. A year ago, in June of 2011, we had the first conference on Israeli literature, Hebrew literature, dealing specifically with 1948 from the perspective of the Nakba here at Stanford University, with a variety of fascinating lectures. These materials are now being prepared for print. I hope they'll be out soon. I recently finished a book which came out in German a week ago on this topic, a book in which I compare how a German and Austrian cultural discourse deals with the difficult history of Austria and Germany, and how, on the other hand, Israeli cultural discourse, Israeli literature deals with the Nakba from 1948 to the present. I could say more to this later on, but I'd like to give you one specific example of a book I'm dealing with in my own book, which is the book Achuzat Dajani by the Israeli writer Alon Chilun. The book tells the story, a fictional story of the family Dajani, a Palestinian family residing in Jaffa until 1948. The father of the family, Fuad Dajani, was a physician. He founded the hospital in Jaffa. And in a fictional manner, Alon Chilu in this novel accounts for the story of this family, but also for the expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine in 1948. Now, what makes the book interesting is not just the fact that it's a very interesting novel, but it was also a very successful novel, both in terms of critical acclaim and in terms of the numbers the book actually sold, which I find quite interesting because I see in it an indication that there is a growing willingness on the side of Israelis to at least learn more or confront themselves with the fate of Palestinians in 1948. As you see here, this little map, one of the things that Alon Chilu did in his book is to create a map in which he takes the city of Tel Aviv, that's where the story takes place, and present not just a map of how the city looks like today with major buildings like the Azrieli towers, etc., pointed on the map, but also he mentions here Palestinians' neighborhoods such as, let me get closer, so the Muslim cemetery that is now disseminated is mentioned here. He's presenting here Pardes Montefiore and Achuzat Dajani, so the Dajani estate, the Palestinian Dajani estate, the Somail Palestinian village, Jamassin. These are all Palestinian settlements and villages that were in the space of the city of Tel Aviv today and vanished in 1948. So the book brings also visually into the narrative the Palestinian story into the foreground. Now, after the book was published, this is about 3 months ago, February of 2012, the city of Tel Aviv invited the Dajani family, who's residing now all over the world, including the Arab world, to unveil the Dajani piazza, or the Dajani square in the city of Jaffa, as a way to commemorate both the history of the family Dajani and also to account for the work of the Dr. Fuad Dajani, who created or founded the hospital in the city of Jaffa again. So in a way, one could see how a novel deals with the story and how the city of Tel Aviv, in a very interesting way, comes to term with that chapter in its own history. Now, obviously, I don't want to insinuate or suggest that these examples are all-encompassing, and this is how we move forward, and this is the future, and how wonderful things are. But I see in them very interesting examples of some of the topics I hope we discuss today and tomorrow. So, the question, why now, what's new, and what is needed, and here we go back to our moment of laughter around the table a minute ago. We all know that what we used to call the peace process is in shambles. It's not exactly, at the moment, something worthwhile mentioning or discussing. But still, even if this is the case, I think that thinking about questions of history, thinking about questions of memory, thinking about new and different forms of cohabitation, which are related to the question of narrative and how we account for the past, should be at the center of the discussion. Because regardless what kind of solutions we may come up with, not we, but politicians, the fact is that people of the Middle East and Israelis and Palestinians are bound to live together one way or another in the future without a more critical, more reflective engaging of their common mutual history. This future looks rather dim. So for me, a very important question is, can we do more and can we do better? Elazar.
Just before you finish, can you say a couple of more sentences of how does it move from a book to a commemoration in the square with the Dajani family? Where is the activism coming?
Well, the activism comes from a TV report on the family Dajani, which was aired on TV. An architect in Tel Aviv seeing that report on TV, going to the city council and saying that there isn't even a tomb commemorating on the grave of Dr. Fuad Dajani. There is not even a stone commemorating who is lying in the ground. So the first step was for the city of Tel Aviv to put a tombstone on the grave of Dr. Fuad Dajani. And then in the second tack, a Palestinian member of the Tel Aviv Jaffa municipality brought the suggestion of naming the square where the Dajani hospital is still located after Dr. Fuad Dajani. After a few years of debate, it was approved by the council of the city of Tel Aviv Jaffa. And in February of 2012, they invited the Dajani family for the unveiling of the square, and the naming of the square, the Dajani Square. At the same time, we see this novel emerging, a very popular novel, critically acclaimed, dealing with the history of the family Dajani in a fictional manner, by the way, but then drawing the attention of, I would say, thousands of Israelis to that chapter of their history.
The book is out in English?
The book is out in English, and the book is called in English not Dajani, but Rajani, where they meant the house of Rajani. Yeah. Alon Chilu is the writer.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.